Imagine an empire so vast it stretched across 11 time zones. An empire armed with tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, its armies stationed across Europe and Asia, its ideology echoing through revolutions in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. In the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union was not just a country, it was one half of the world. And yet, by 1991, this superpower would dissolve almost overnight. But before we can understand how the Soviet Union collapsed, we first need to understand how it rose. The story begins not in 1991, but in the fires of revolution in 1917. And it is a story of ambition, fear, ideology, and power, a story where victories often disguised fatal flaws, and where the seeds of collapse were planted in the very foundations of the Soviet system itself. The Russian Empire at the dawn of the 20th century was vast but fragile. Under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, the empire faced poverty, inequality, and unrest. Most of its people were peasants bound by traditional agriculture, while its elites lived lives of luxury. When World War I erupted in 1914, Russia suffered staggering defeats against Germany, and millions of soldiers and civilians died. Hunger spread, industry faltered, and resentment grew. By 1917, the cracks were too deep to hide. Protests in Petrograd led to the abdication of the Tsar, ending centuries of Romanov rule. But the provisional government that replaced him struggled to hold power. Then came the Bolsheviks, radical revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin, promising peace, bread, and land. Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917. A brutal civil war followed, pitting the Reds, the Bolsheviks, against the Whites, a mix of monarchists, liberals, and foreign-backed forces. By 1922, the Reds had triumphed, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, was born. The Soviet Union was more than just a new government. It was an experiment unlike anything the world had ever seen. For the first time, a state openly embraced Marxist ideology. The means of production were seized from private owners and put under the control of the state. The new regime abolished private property, sought to redistribute wealth, and promised a classless society. On paper, it looked like a worker's paradise. In reality, it would be ruled with iron fists, with power concentrated in the Communist Party, and ultimately in the hands of one man, Joseph Stalin. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals and became the Soviet Union's undisputed leader. Stalin's rule was transformative and terrifying. Determined to modernize a backward country, he launched a campaign of forced collectivization, seizing peasant lands and merging them into state farms. Resistance was met with brutal repression. Millions died in famines, especially in Ukraine, where the Holodomor famine claimed millions of lives. At the same time, Stalin pushed rapid industrialization, building massive factories, dams, and railways. The Soviet Union went from an agrarian society to an industrial power in just a few decades. But progress came at a horrific cost. Political purges filled prisons and gulags with millions. Fear was everywhere. Yet, by the late 1930s, the USSR had become a formidable state, ready to play a decisive role in world affairs. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it seemed the USSR might not survive. Hitler's armies pushed deep into Soviet territory, besieging Leningrad, capturing vast regions, and reaching the gates of Moscow. But the Soviets fought back with resilience and sacrifice. The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-43 became the turning point of World War II. In one of the bloodiest battles in human history, Soviet forces encircled and destroyed the German Sixth Army. From there, the Red Army pushed west, all the way to Berlin in 1945. By the war's end, the Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people, but it emerged victorious and stronger than ever. It now controlled Eastern Europe, installing communist regimes in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. A new world order was forming, with the USSR on one side and the United States on the other. This was the dawn of the Cold War, for the next 4 decades. The world would be defined by the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. Two superpowers, two ideologies, communism versus capitalism, locked in a struggle for global dominance. Unlike past conflicts, this was not fought with direct battles between the two giants, but through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and, above all, the threat of nuclear annihilation. By 1949, the Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear weapons. In 1957, they launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, stunning the world and proving that Soviet science could outpace the West. The space race had begun, symbolizing not just technology but ideological competition. When Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, the Soviet Union seemed to be leading humanity into the future. At the same time, its military power was expanding rapidly. The Soviet Red Army was the largest on Earth, and its nuclear arsenal grew to tens of thousands of warheads. It's capable of destroying the planet many times over. But the Cold War was not just about weapons and rockets. It was about influence. The Soviet Union supported revolutionary movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In Cuba, Fidel Castro embraced communism, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the world came perilously close to nuclear war. For 13 tense days, humanity held its breath as American and Soviet ships confronted each other. In the end, both sides backed down. But the message was clear. The rivalry between the USSR and the USA could decide the fate of the world. At home, the Soviet Union projected strength, but cracks were already forming. Its planned economy achieved rapid industrial growth in the early decades, but by the 1960s and 70s, inefficiencies became clear. While the United States embraced consumer culture, supermarkets full of goods, the average Soviet citizen often faced shortages. Lines for bread, shoes, or meat were common. The USSR could build rockets and tanks, but struggled to produce enough decent housing, cars, or consumer goods. Still, the appearance of strength kept the Soviet Union feared and respected on the world stage. During the Brezhnev era, from the mid-1960s to early 1980s, the Soviet Union seemed stable. It had reached nuclear parity with the United States. It maintained control over Eastern Europe. It expanded its influence in the Third World. But beneath the surface, stagnation was setting in. Corruption grew. The bureaucracy was bloated. Innovation lagged. While the West saw revolutions in technology and culture, the Soviet Union remained rigid, controlled, and cautious. And then came Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support a friendly communist regime. It expected a quick victory. Instead, it faced a grinding guerrilla war against Afghan fighters who were armed and funded by the United States and its allies. The war dragged on for a decade, costing tens of thousands of Soviet lives, draining resources, and demoralizing the public. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, symbol of overreach and decline. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was still a superpower, but one showing signs of exhaustion. Its economy lagged far behind the West. Its people were weary of shortages and repression. Its military consumed vast resources, but its society was stagnant. Yet outwardly it still looked formidable, still commanded respect and fear. And no one could yet imagine that within a single decade, this mighty empire would vanish from the map. But that collapse was coming. And it would be triggered not by defeat in battle, but by internal contradictions, economic weakness, and political permitical. Reform gone wrong. To understand how the Soviet Union, once so powerful, unraveled in 1991. We must move from the story of its rise and global dominance to the story of its decline and fall. And that story begins with a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, who believed he could save the Soviet system, but whose reforms would instead accelerate its destruction. The year was 1985, and the Soviet Union was standing at a crossroads. After decades of tight control and rigid governance, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, rose to power. He was young, energetic, and unlike his aging predecessors, he believed The Soviet Union could be saved through reform. But what Gorbachev could not yet see was that the very reforms he would introduce to revive the USSR state would instead hasten its collapse. When Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party, the Soviet Union was in trouble. The economy was stagnant. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources. Eastern Europe was restless. The people were weary of shortages, long queues for basic goods, and a system that seemed frozen in time. While the United States was beginning to boom again in the 1980s, under Reagan, with rapid technological innovation and a consumer-driven economy, the USSR seemed stuck in the past. Factories still churned out tanks and rockets, but everyday life was filled with scarcity. Gorbachev knew something had to change. His answer was twofold: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. Glasnost allowed more: freedom of expression, a limited press, and the release of some political prisoners. For the first time, citizens could openly criticize the government without immediate fear of arrest. It was revolutionary for a society long silenced by censorship. Perestroika was meant to reform the economy, to allow some market mechanisms, more efficiency, and less central control. On paper, these reforms looked like a breath of fresh air. But in practice, they exposed the deep cracks in the Soviet system. For decades, the government had controlled every aspect of economic life. Factories produced goods not based on demand, but on state quotas. Prices were fixed, innovation was stifled. Now, as Gorbachev loosened the reins, the system faltered. Shortages grew worse, inflation rose. People lost faith not only in the economy, but in the Communist Party itself. Glasnost, meanwhile, unleashed a flood of criticism. Joust journalists and ordinary citizens began speaking openly about corruption, inefficiency, and repression. Long suppressed stories about Stalin's purges, famines, and gulags came to light, and what had once been whispers became front-page news. Instead of strengthening the system, glasnost eroded its very legitimacy. At the same time, the Cold War rivalry. What the United States was changing, Gorbachev wanted to reduce tensions with the West, cut military spending, and focus on domestic reform. He signed arms reduction treaties with President Reagan, withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan, and began to scale back the empire's costly commitments abroad. While these moves improved relations with the West, they sent a dangerous message. To the Soviet bloc, Moscow was no longer willing or able to enforce its dominance in Eastern Europe. Communist regimes had long relied on the threat of Soviet tanks to maintain power. But when Gorbachev announced that the USSR would no longer intervene militarily in satellite states, a tidal wave of change swept across the region. In 1989, protests broke out in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. One by one, the communist governments collapsed. The most dramatic moment came on November 9, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. Crowds of East and West Germans climbed atop the wall, smashing it with hammers, embracing in tears of joy. The symbol of the Cold War was gone. For decades, the Soviet Union had controlled half of Europe. Now, in just a few months, its empire evaporated, and there was nothing Gorbachev could do to stop it. But the greatest challenge came not from abroad, but from within. The Soviet Union was not a single nation. It was a federation of republics, home to more than 100 ethnic groups. For decades, the Kremlin had suppressed nationalist movements. But under glasnost, those movements erupted. In the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, people demanded independence. In the Caucasus, Armenians and Azerbaijanis clashed. In Central Asia, tensions flared. Even within Russia itself, calls for sovereignty grew louder. The empire was unraveling from the inside. By 1990, the situation was spiraling. The economy was collapsing. Shops were empty. Lines stretched for hours just to buy bread or butter. The currency was unstable. Workers went on strike. Meanwhile, political authority was breaking down. In Russia, a new figure rose to prominence: Boris Yeltsin. Charismatic and bold, Yeltsin championed Russian sovereignty over the authority of the Soviet Union. For ordinary Russians, he seemed like a man of the people, a contrast to the increasingly embattled Gorbachev. Tensions between the two leaders grew, creating a power struggle at the heart of the state. Then came the final blow. In August 1991, as Gorbachev vacationed in Crimea, hardline communists staged a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Gorbachev was placed under house arrest. The coup leaders hoped to restore order, end the reforms, and preserve the Soviet system. But they underestimated the people and Boris Yeltsin. Climbing atop a tank outside the Russian parliament, Yeltsin denounced the coup and called for resistance. Crowds poured into the streets, defying the army. In just 3 days, the coup collapsed. But its failure destroyed what little authority the Communist Party had left. In the months that followed, the Soviet Union disintegrated. Republic after republic declared independence. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, Central Asia broke away. By December 1991, only fragments remained. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev addressed the nation, announcing his resignation and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, once the rival of the United States, once the master of half the world, had ceased to exist. The collapse was breathtaking in its speed. For decades, the Soviet Union had seemed unshakable, a permanent fixture of world politics. And yet, in just a few years, it crumbled into history. Why? Historians still debate the causes, but several answers emerge. The Soviet economy, centrally planned and rigid, could not keep up with the dynamism of the capitalist West. The political system, built on repression, could not adapt to openness. The empire, ruling over unwilling nations, could not contain the tide of nationalism. And when reform finally came, it was too little. Too latent, it unleashed forces that tore the state apart. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just the end of a country. It was the end of an era. For nearly half a century, the world had been divided between two superpowers, locked in nuclear standoff. With the USSR gone, the United States stood alone as the sole superpower. The Cold War was over. The legacy of the Soviet Union endures. Its collapse reshaped global politics, redrew maps, and left behind deep scars. In Russia, the 1990s were marked by chaos, economic collapse, and humiliation. Many Russians came to see the fall of the USSR not as liberation, but as a tragedy. That sense of loss would shape Russia's politics for decades to come, influencing leaders like Vladimir Putin, who rose to power promising to restore Russian pride and strength. And what about the nuclear arsenal? At the time of collapse, the Soviet Union possessed the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in history. Thousands of warheads were spread across newly independent states like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. In the years that followed, international agreements ensured those weapons were returned to Russia, leaving it as the world's second nuclear power, behind only the United States. The legacy of Soviet military might continues to this day, a reminder that while the Soviet Union collapsed, the power it once wielded did not vanish entirely. Looking back, the story of the Soviet Union is one of extremes. It rose from the ashes. A revolution transformed itself into an industrial and military giant, defeated Nazi Germany, launched humanity into space, and challenged the world's most powerful nation. And yet, in the end, it could not provide its own citizens with stability, prosperity, or freedom. Its collapse was sudden, but its causes had been building for decades. The seeds of destruction were sown in its foundations, an economy that could not innovate, a political system that crushed dissent, an empire held together by force. When the moment came, it all unraveled with astonishing speed. And so we return to the image we began with, a mighty empire spanning 11 time zones. Armed with thousands of nuclear weapons, feared and respected across the globe, gone in a matter of months. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but its shadow still stretches across our world. From NATO's expansion, to conflicts in Eastern Europe, to Russia's ongoing rivalry with the United States, the echoes of the Cold War remain. History teaches us that even the mightiest empires can fall, and often their greatest threats come not from without, but from within.